Hey everybody, so I'm here to talk about scaling with legacy code, and I think legacy code is something that you're hopefully all familiar with. It's a very common thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what legacy code is, its technicalities, how it evolves around technical debt, and how you can scale with that, and how you can try and deal with that in your teams. Certainly from the story of LearnUpon and our growth and our evolution, we're no different to any companies and any successful companies that go through that journey. So just a little bit about myself, just to start with. My name is Des Anderson, CTO, co-founder of LearnUpon, as you know. I've kind of about 15 years experience building enterprise applications. Since I graduated from college, I kind of fell into the e-learning and educational space and never got out of it. I fell in love with it. It's an amazing industry and market to get into. It exposes you to so many different technologies, so many different challenges, and various different sort of features and stuff like that can end up in a sort of educational platform like LearnUpon. As a result, that creates lots of challenges and specifically stuff around the likes of legacy code, if you're not aware of it. So just a bit of history about LearnUpon. We were founded in 2012, and since that time, we've been scaling and evolving, and thankfully we've reached that point where we're one of the lucky startups to come out of an incubator and call ourselves let's say a proper company, whatever that means. Okay, we're no longer a startup, but we've certainly gone through a lot of the pains and the growing pains of the startup environment. In that time, we've scaled our business to offices around the world. So we're headquartered in Dublin, Ireland. Most of the magic that happens in our product happens here in Belgrade. So most of our technical team are based here in Belgrade, where we do all the coding and all the good stuff. But we've got offices in Philadelphia and Sydney as well, and that's with the view of supporting our customer base and making sure that we can support our user base worldwide. As part of that, I suppose, just what is LearnUpon? LearnUpon is an e-learning platform, an LMS, learning management system. I'm sure you're all familiar with using stuff like Pluralsight, various different tools like Moodle and things like that to take online courses. So basically, LearnUpon is that. It's a learning platform. So we're not content experts. We don't create the courses. We provide the platform for our customers to deploy their courses to their users. That's what they use LearnUpon for. So in the time, we've scaled to over 5 million users. We handle lots of big data, millions and millions of API requests, webhooks, exam questions, answers. There's lots of big data, and as a result, big challenges in there. Our app features lots of different stuff like reporting, reminder notifications, mechanisms for managers to see what their teams are doing with their online education. So it's not always just about the learner taking courses. A learning platform can be quite a vast application to be working in. So like we have features like e-commerce, big reporting stuff that goes on, exporting and emailing and scheduled reports and things like that. So I think like the team that are here will nod and agree. They don't find themselves doing online learning type things. It's quite big challenges within the app as a result. Luckily, in that time, we got to be awarded Technology of the Company in Ireland last year at the end of 2018, and I think that's a great reflection, I suppose, of thankfully, where LearnUpon is going and what we're trying to do. Underneath all that, which is what we're here today to talk about, and Uncle Bob will be happy to hear, we are a Rails-based app. We have been scaling that, and we've got Angular and JS in the front end. We're currently looking at moving to Angular. So it's quite an interesting problem and story for us as we've gone along. So what's legacy code? Sounds like a boring question. I find it fascinating because there's a million different definitions out there for legacy code. Again, Uncle Bob himself has that lovely quote where it strikes kind of fear in the hearts of programmers, right? So like, if I was to turn around to you today and say, we're going to do a sprint and we're going to tackle legacy code, you're going to be like, no thanks, right? So that's absolutely true. Mike Fetters, who some of you might be familiar with. If you're not, I would encourage you to go and YouTube Mike Fetters. He has some great talks and books on this kind of topic. He has a nice definition, which is like code that is not tested. It's nice. I don't think it encapsulates everything, but it's certainly a way that you can think about or try to identify your legacy code. Ones that I quite like are stuff that you can say that code that's not easily changed, okay? And that's particularly important when you're trying to scale your company and scale your teams and scale your processes. So if you're developers and you can't get into the code easily, that's legacy code. That's gonna not scale for you, and you need to find a way to resolve that. Kind of linked to that is code that you're afraid to change. So again, you're probably familiar with that scenario of where you've got to make changes to a specific code base, and the guys are like, no, we'll leave that for 2 weeks. The guy that wrote it is on holidays. Okay, that's like a perfect indicator of some legacy code that you're afraid to change. In the middle of that is kind of very old code. I don't particularly agree with that. That's quite variable. Like, just because code is old doesn't mean that it's legacy. You need to be careful with that definition. It's all too easy for us to just want to rewrite code just because it's old. But code that's old can serve a purpose, and particularly if it's working efficiently, then it doesn't mean that it's legacy code. So when a dev says, why did they do that? I'm quite familiar with that, because as a co-founder and CTO, that's a fancy term for someone that wrote the code at the start of the project, right? I just got labeled with the co-founder CTO role. I was the developer there, writing the hacks, writing the stuff just to ship product to a customer. So the team will roll up, they'll be going, Des, what the hell is this? You know, and basically I'm just sort of saying, don't ask. It was just done on that Wednesday morning when we needed to do it. So that, for me, is a great way of thinking about your legacy code. This is something I'm very interested in. The more that my team are asking me about that, or I hear the team interacting and asking those questions, sure a sign that you're hitting on a legacy code issue. To step back a little bit, what is the source of legacy code? So this tower, if you imagine here on the right-hand side, at the base, we all start a company. Every company started up, which is no surprise. At the base, you start off with amazing intentions, okay? You decide on your framework, you decide on your models, your database layer, the front-end layer is, at our point in time, it was jQuery UI. All these great intentions, and at some point, your tower just starts to wobble, it starts to get brittle, and your code just starts to pull apart. That's normal. It's a natural thing and a natural evolution of a company like LearnUpon. So, in other words, like for us, if we didn't try and ship code as quickly as we could, we wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be standing here today for sure. But in that, you end up ignoring the likes of Bertrand Meyer, who is a great way of describing code for me. It's the idea that code is closed to modification, but it's open to extension. So in LearnUpon, we have, for example, like the concept of a user. Most applications will have like a user model, a user table. Any code that you write around that user base should be closed to modification. You can extend it easily. That's what you're trying to aim for, but your code should be closed. So if you have a look there in the middle, that piece of legacy code that gets introduced, at some point in your startup, your customer is going to go, I love that you can create users, but what I'd like to do is invite them. And what you end up doing is then editing all that user code and trying to build invites into the middle of it. And at some point, you're going to add two-factor authentication. If you're not separating that code and making it closed, you're going to end up with legacy code and lots of problems, okay? So during that journey, hopefully you get successful, and at that point, the product police come along, and that's where your processes really start slowing down, and that's where you've got to kind of back out and start putting your focus towards your legacy code and those types of issues. Ultimately, for me, it's bad design patterns, no doubt about it. It's very difficult to start up and be a successful startup concentrating on design patterns, but ultimately that's what happens, and that is, again, like a normal thing. The likes of a Rails framework, any framework really, but Rails in particular, in our case, doesn't help you. So throughout Rails, it has the concept of, say, like an active record layer, which is the database layer. So it has nice code in there, so you can do user.where email is bleh, and that'll return a user for you. So when you're bootstrapping and you're writing code quickly, you're going to end up with user.where scattered all over your code. Okay, that's basically what happens with a framework. With LearnUpon, what we realized we had to do, if you imagine trying to change that code to find users based on maybe like a permission set or something like that, in addition to email, you then have to change all this code all over the place. So the approach that we take with LearnUpon is we have all our code located in what we call finders. utils and services. So the finders is the part of the app in one specific point of your code base that we know reads from the database, and they're split out into model finders. So we know, for example, if someone joins the company, if they want to understand where users come from within the app, at least we can say verbally, go to the finders, you'll find a user finder, that's where all the code is. It's not littered and scattered throughout the app. Why would you care? So it's about, I suppose, cost ultimately. Unfortunately, that's what we need. Companies need money to run, right? But like if it's 50% of your team's effort and between 40 to 90% of your costs, that's going to have a huge impact on your growth, and ultimately you're going to end up stagnating. So that's why we care. It's hugely important. The other part of it for me is that technical debt and legacy code is something that not everybody understands, and especially that idea of like the top levels maybe of the management within your company are not going to understand what legacy code is. You need to try and find a way to describe that to them and fight your fight. The ironic inverse of that is if you don't regret early engineering decisions, you absolutely over-engineered. So, my best advice is to you, if you are out there and you're looking to do your own startup, don't over-engineer. You're not Google, you're not Intercom, you're not Stripe yet, you're not Box. Don't over-engineer. Get product out to your customers. That's the best thing that you can do, and then you can start refactoring and start trying to scale. Scaling technically is difficult, but it's possible. There's lots of resources out there. What's difficult is starting a company and getting your customer base. So you need to be focused on that. If you end up over-engineering, you'll end up probably going nowhere, which is an unfortunate truth. Technical debt. I don't want to get too embroiled in this, but just technical debt, I think for me, again, is an important one. Legacy code is a branch of technical debt, but technical debt is this very morbid representation. For me, if you call it something like technical health, product health, you'll do yourself a favor. I personally would like to be a team leader in the product health team within LearnUpon than the team that manages technical debt. I think you'll find that you'll be very quickly forgotten and end up in the corner of the room. So you need to discover what it means to you and to your team and to your company. Everybody's different, okay? And just remember, it's just a metaphor. Ultimately, it's just a metaphor. You need to try and understand what it means to you. So you can ask questions about what that means to you, and there are ways that I'll go through that and tell you how you can do that. But what you don't want to do is go to Google, search for what is legacy code. It will give you some answers, and then you'll start comparing yourself to these ideals that ultimately come from different companies and different sources. You don't want to do that. You want to understand what it means to you. I come from a C++ background, Java. I've done that for years, so I've been working in compilers. I'm familiar with teams saying where we're going to take 2 weeks, we're going to take 3 weeks, I'm going to remove all our compiler warnings, and therefore our technical debt is gone, and our legacy code is gone, right? So it's quite an interesting way to view it. It's definitely not correct. Like, compiler warnings are maybe an indicator of code that isn't looked after very well. It might be an indicator that you have legacy code, but it isn't your legacy code. It's not your technical debt. So don't get fooled by those kind of false positives. Getting back to the code is a very old scenario. Like, if it's old code, people would prefer to rewrite code. So myself as a developer, and I'm sure you'd agree, I would much prefer to rewrite legacy code myself, because then I feel I can understand it better, rather than looking at code that isn't commented and you've got no idea basically what's going on. Don't be tempted by that. It's generally not worth it. The likes of COBOL, stuff I would have studied in college. Thankfully, I never got a job in it. COBOL is horrendous. It's an awful programming language. But ultimately, billions of dollars are managed through mainframes running COBOL today in the financial sector. So, you have to find a technology that works for you and serves your purpose. That's ultimately what our jobs are. So don't get siloed in technology. Make sure that you can program in different languages. Even if you don't do that daily, you will learn a lot from different programming languages, even Rails, okay? So technical debt, for me, is anything that prevents you from doing your job effectively. It's not just code. I would suspect some members of the LearnUpon team will giggle when I say that, but it is literally the the cable on the back of your monitor that jiggles every time you hit the tab key and then your monitor flickers, that's technical debt. It's going to irritate you. It's going to prevent you from doing your job. So don't accept that kind of stuff. Be very aware of your environment and that kind of thing. That's the type of stuff that creates kind of bad culture in your teams. It will go against you. It won't help you scale and that kind of thing. So just be very aware of that. It isn't just all about code. And again, kind of rewrites just aren't generally worth it. You'll end up supporting 2 versions of code. Ultimately, there are some reasons why you might rewrite code. If you've got like a DLL compiled, you've lost the source code, then yeah, I'm afraid you're probably going to have to rewrite that, okay? But ultimately, it's not worth the effort. So getting back to what does it all mean to you, it's so uber important for you to understand that before you can start scaling. It's, again, all too easy for us to just sort of say, right, let's get to it. We've got some sprints. Let's try and tackle some code. You've got to be clever in your attack, and you've got to be clever about what you're trying to choose to update within your features and within your app. For me, it boils down to some basic stuff. So like high readability within your code. Basic things like commenting and things, those are the things that will add more time to your delivery and more time on your developers and ultimately causes more stress when they're trying to edit code. So making sure code is readable is hugely important. Getting back to basics around patterns, around, if you've got variable names, don't put the variable type in there, like int customer ID. Don't assign data types to your variable names. Make sure that it's extremely flexible, but absolutely comment. Making sure that it's highly extensible, going back to the Bertrand Mayer idea that you're not changing code constantly within one particular module, but make sure that you can reuse that. And that's extremely important so that you can use that throughout your feature base. And then finally, working on your dependencies. Again, kind of with LearnUpon, we wouldn't be here. Like, we had to bootstrap very quickly. You end up with a Rails application where you start pulling in all these different gems, all these different libraries. You have to do that because you don't have the time to code it yourself. But over time, you need to be very aware that you need to start removing those dependencies. Particularly gems, like we had to integrate with Stripe to do our billing in the early days. So we would have used the Stripe gem for that. Try and be aware that those types of libraries, they will be updated constantly. And if you don't have somebody caring for that, that ultimately becomes legacy code for you. Those APIs change, security issues will come on board, all that kind of good stuff. If that gets forgotten, it's a massive migraine waiting to happen. So I touched a little bit with Mike Fetters and tests. Tests are a tool. They're not your silver bullet. And ultimately, what will happen with some companies is that they end up having more test code than they do actual feature code that they have to maintain. And that's quite important when you're doing like large framework updates. So I'm going to get to that a little bit. Like with Rails, when we started out LearnUpon, it was version 3 on Rails. And we've recently just jumped to Rails 5.2. It's a massive effort. And when you have lots of test code, that can prove quite difficult. So just be careful with your tests. TDD is a great thing. But just be careful with what you test. Just because you have full coverage within your code isn't going to make life that much easier for you, okay? So it's about testing what's core for your app. So something like an API, something where you need uptime, maybe webhooks are quite important. Say, for example, for our customers, that's where we would have tests. That's what's important for us. So it's not easy. Hindsight and 2020 vision and all that good stuff. Standing here now, we've learned a lot, and we're continually evolving in what we do and trying to approach how we adapt our code. But ultimately, it's not easy, and you need to dedicate time to that. GitHub and Shopify, God bless them, they are massive Rails shops. They have some serious scar wounds as regards how they've gone through upgrade paths and how they maintain their code. Particularly Shopify. If you Google them, they have great resources and blog posts about that and kind of post-mortems about how they've upgraded their Rails frameworks. Shopify is a good example for me as well, just as regards the amount of tests that they had. They spend a lot of time maintaining and migrating their tests as they've tried to remove legacy code. which sounds like an awful lot of resourcing going into that. So again, just be very, very careful about what you're testing and what you're not. If I look back over the path of LearnUpon and where we've come from, we started with jQuery UI. We migrated that in one fell swoop into AngularJS, which ended in tears, which I'll get to and why. Similarly, for Rails 3 to 3.2, we were migrating that framework, and we were removing code dependencies and rewriting gems and moving all our framework to a totally different hosting environment all at the same time, which sounds like a migraine, and it was great fun, but we had lots of lessons learned from it. It was painful. Less painful was going to Rails 5.2, which I'll get to and why that was. And now we're looking to move from AngularJS and start implementing Angular. LearnUpon is no different from most startups, I would imagine. We're this monolithic app. We're now migrating out to a microservice type code base. And all that's kind of coupled into how we're going to Angular. And again, that kind of plan of attack, which I'll get to, you need to be very clever about how you do that. So it sounds utopian, and it does, and did it work? Yes, but not without tears. So when you look at the Rails upgrade guides, maybe the only people here doing Rails is the LearnUpon team, but if you look at the Rails upgrade guides, the first sentence is, make sure you have tests. Every framework will tell you this. And we kind of went, oops, we don't have tests, so what are we going to do? What it failed on Rails 3 to 3.2, for example, we were rewriting logic while updating the framework and removing gems. So that was a bad idea. So you need to separate your preparation work and your refactoring from your actual upgrading. Okay, that's hugely important, and often goes missing beneath everything that you're doing. You know, so when we got to Rails 5.2, we had everything broken up into these little blocks, and we had this conveyor belt going of little chunks of code going to production. That was all our preparation work, all happening even before we got to dropping the framework update onto our production servers. So when it came to D-Day and we went to Rails 5.2, thankfully it went extremely, extremely well. The team nailed it, you know, because of all that preparation work, their hard-earned efforts of just communicating between themselves, between the QA team, and making sure that you have your teams extremely knitted and close together. If you find that maybe that you're in an environment where the QA team are separated from the devs and they hate each other, right? It's that typical scenario where they're kind of booing and hissing at each other. You need to work on that. That's going to go against you again when you're trying to do large-scale changes like this, or indeed just maintaining old parts of your app. You need to make sure that you're communicating heavily. A nice benefit of that is that when we went through Rails 5.2, as I say, we learned a lot from each other. We were communicating more. We weren't relying on all these automated tests to try and act as a safety bed. Okay, so tests for me are something that allow you to change code with less fear, but they're not necessarily going to solve all your problems. Like, we had all our webhooks fully tested, so we were hugely confident when we went to this Rails upgrade that it was all going to work. And of course, when we went live, we had one bug in our webhooks, right? And it was because we were focused on our happy path testing. So again, just be clever about your tests. Make sure that you're focused on your unhappy path testing, stuff that can go wrong. Feed your tests with bad data. Don't always assume that everything is going to work well. So it's a never-ending story. So just getting back to that idea that you can't tackle this stuff just on a sprint, or 2 sprints, or 3 sprints. You need to make sure that it's a continued discussion within your team, and making sure that the rest of your company understand that. You know, you need to have a time split in there. So when you're doing your sprints, allocate 80% time to your features, but make sure you got 20% on your legacy code and updating code as you go. So as I say, when we went through Rails 5.2, we learned more, we just huddled more, we were communicating more. There's various laws of development. Some of them are quite humorous. Conway's law, though, for me, is one of the better ones. And it's the concept that your product and your code is a huge reflection on the amount of communication and the quality of communication within your team. So it's the idea of per communication, per code. So you've got to be communicating. Particularly when you're in these agile environments and you've got separate teams, maybe working in different locations, which is what we would have. You need to make sure that they're communicating at an extreme level and talking about the code and talking about what they're doing. One example around that where we saw that, most of the magic happens here, as I say, in Belgrade. We have one team in Dublin as well that do some infrastructure stuff with the Rails app. We create this idea of guilds, and we have a thing called a tech council. So the tech council is basically a meeting that happens every week. The guys from the different teams get together. They discuss how they're going to tackle an Angular upgrade. How are they going to tackle the microservices and that kind of thing, okay? So it's hugely useful. So your plan of attack, hugely important. So before you get to understand where your legacy code is, you need to have a way to try and measure that and try and understand what that is for your application. The big one for me is file churn. And file churn is the concept. You can do this in GitHub. You can go and look at, say, for example, a few pull requests from your team. Maybe it's a new feature. Maybe you're updating existing code. File churn will tell you, are you changing hundreds of files just for one feature, or is it just one section of your code base? The ideal is the one section of your code base. So going back to that idea of Rails and active record, it has user.where. You do a feature where you need to change that code, and it's littered all over your code base. Hopefully your file churn is low, so it means you're only changing your user finder, the bit that goes to the database to get your data. You're not changing tons of business logic and your controllers and your views just to make a change like that. File churn feeds then into delivery time and dev speed and the number of devs that it takes to do those feature changes. So if you have a slow delivery time now, it's only going to get worse, and you need to be very focused in on that. Again, file churn would give you a very high indicator as regards like the amount of stress and frustration your developers are having trying to make changes within the code base. Of course, function size and readability are just forgotten gems. Like the basic knowledge that a smaller function is better can get forgotten because as you're scaling as a startup, you're just writing code, you're just shipping code, you don't care about function size. It's the last thing on your mind. So that and readability and adding comments on your functions, and I know it sounds like basic stuff, but as a developer, I hate commenting code. When I'm writing code, I just want to get to the cool stuff and get stuff working. But that's the type of stuff that will prevent you from scaling, particularly when you've got, say, new people joining your company. And it doesn't matter if they're like just, fresh out of college and they're just joining and they're starting on their career through to veteran senior developers. They need information and they need to understand how your code works. So comments are so underrated in my view. Don't measure dev speed, and I've mentioned this in both the same. So you measure your dev speed and you don't. So don't measure how fast your developers code. It's the worst thing you can do. We all have bad days. We all have stuff going on, maybe outside of work. Stuff that's variable like that. Don't confuse that with your metrics. Focus in on your file churn, your CI/CD pipeline. Focus in on how quickly you're shipping value to customers. Don't focus in on the minor variable stuff like that. Final one about knowing your plan of attack is your firewall. So your firewall for me is your management. For example, like if it just is a quick show of hands, who here is dealing with legacy code? They know you're dealing with legacy code and technical debt daily, right? So sad truth, we've lots of hands. If you kept your hand up and tell me that that your battle is trying to communicate that to your management, do you feel that it's recognized within companies? So yeah. Show of hands. Okay, so the unfortunate truth is trying to make that a continued discussion. Your product owners and project managers need to ship features, and you need to have the language that they understand so you can tell them, actually, we can't ship the features quickly because of this legacy code. You need to find a way to explain that to them all the way through to your CFO and CEO levels, They talk in dollars and money amounts, and that's your language. That's how you target them, I had quite a funny conversation with a CFO once about technical debt, and he understood debt to be money, So you've got to try and have that conversation and talk at the same level. The other element of it for me is just procrastination. When, as developers, when we're faced with a mass of problems to solve, we will very quickly choose the easy path and we'll choose the easier thing to do. And my best advice is to you is just start. When you're faced with that big list of bugs, that big list of tasks you need to do to get something live, to tackle legacy code, just start, because you'll be amazed at what you can do. Particularly as a developer, we're honed in on finding the quick path through things. We're good at automating. We're good at scripting. We're good at finding quick keyboard commands to make our life easier. So try and use that skill that you have to tackle big problems. You'll be amazed at what happens. Find your garden path and shed and not the barbecue. This is something that I always try and remember when we're trying to tackle features within product and try and scale. If you imagine you're in a garden full of very tall grass, the tall grass is your legacy code. And you know you're going to update the feature, which is your garden shed at the back of the garden. Don't get distracted by the barbecue on the left-hand side. Cut down the grass that will lead you to the garden shed efficiently and quickly. That's what you need to do. You need to be clever about how you're tackling the code within your product. So file churn, measurements, metrics, and all kind of sound scientific. And for me, one big forgotten thing in all of this is the fact that it's not that scientific. So, you know, as a developer, I'm not comfortable standing here talking to you all today, and that's the truth, okay? I would much prefer to be sitting in front of a computer programming. That's it. I'm introverted. I'm a developer. And the natural thing within your team is that your developers are more happy to go to Stack Overflow, to Google, to source solutions to problems. We're not overly comfortable about getting up and talking to team members and other people within our teams. Some of us are better at it, but unfortunately, as developers, that's what we do. That's what we're good at, you know. So we found in LearnUpon, we need to embrace that, and you need to challenge that. Find ways to try and encourage that, because ultimately that idea of Conway's Law and communication is going to help you scale. Absolutely, teamwork beats anything. So stuff like guardrails, so like the 30-minute rule. When you're trying to tackle an issue, try and set yourself 30 minutes. If after 30 minutes you're not going anywhere, and when I mean nowhere, it means you've got zero ideas about where to go. I think we're all familiar with, like when you're trying to solve a problem, you have one or two or three ideas about where you think you can go. Go and explore that. It's a perfect way to learn. But your 30-minute rule is where you've got zero ideas left. You're out of fuel. You don't know what's going on. Get up and go and talk to team members. It's the concept of encouraging buddies within your team. Rubber ducking, I'm sure we're all familiar with that, right? Where you just talk through issues and the solutions just magically just appear in front of you. That's very empowering for you. Basic stuff like, when I say basic, like code reviews and peer coding, it's not basic, it's very difficult. Because ultimately, I've just spent a whole sprint coding a feature, and now I've got to get it code reviewed by someone, and they're going to criticize my work. That's really difficult to deal with, I think. Extremely difficult. And it's something that if your team is uncomfortable with, and it's that idea of radical candor, you're not able to review your team members' code and be healthy about that, it's not going to scale for you. So again, for me, it's just about controlling that expectation with your management. Again, finding their language. Often I find top-level management will assume if you've just added like 5 ninja senior developers onto your team, then your productivity is going to go 10x. It's totally false, unfortunately, and that's just not how it works. It's not that easy. So you need to control expectations as you're scaling your team, as you're adding more people. Ultimately, the bigger the team is growing, you're going to have to mentor more. You're going to have to find ways to scale how you approach adding features, how you communicate. And over time, you should find that you're spending more time communicating with each other than in the actual code. The code just automatically kind of writes itself then from that point of view. Final piece on this is just getting back to the extrovert-introvert idea. So again, you know, Agile and Scrum is an amazing thing. But I feel it's not recognized from the point of view that you've got retros, you've got stand-ups, you've got all these different meetings with flashcards and Post-its. Doesn't lend itself to the introverted nature that we are as developers, okay? We much prefer to not be in that meeting. We prefer to be coding. I don't want to talk about my feelings and how the last sprint went. You know, let's just get features done and code going. So that's a challenge, and that's again something that you're going to need to scale, because ultimately what can happen is the most quiet engineer in your team that never says anything is the evil genius. They know exactly what's going on, and that's the type of people you need to try and find ways to get to talk to them. So stuff like one-on-ones, don't make it this big group discussion. Get one-on-ones, try and find ways to talk to your team. You'll be amazed at what comes out of that. You'll know what's going on the ground. You'll have a closer picture of what the challenges are. So back to the 30-minute rule, I just want to highlight that it's not that you set like a clock on your second or third or fourth monitor counting from 30 to 0. That number is just going to be flicking and distracting you. It doesn't work that way. But stuck in progress means that you're lacking information. It's not you're inadequate. And this is particularly important for senior developers. When you join a new team, you're going to want to have impact. You want to make sure that the company knows they made a great hire in you. And all of a sudden, you find that you don't have this information, you can't do your job properly, you go home frustrated. It means that you're lacking information. That's the fault of your managers, it's the fault of your peers, okay? It doesn't mean you're inadequate. So your plan is created, who executes it? For me, there's two factions within every team. It's the concept of stables and the concept of volatiles. You need both. It's not, the rock stars in your team is not the guy with it's the guys on the sound desk, like over here on the side. They're your rock stars. They're your rock, the person that you can rely on. Those are the guys that love process. They know if they don't implement process, then things fail and things don't scale, okay? But the thing that I find that happens at companies is they focus too much then on the people that love process, and the guys that can get the stuff done are quickly forgotten. You need both, and ultimately volatiles can't work without the stables and vice versa, So you need to remember that, and again, kind of trying to scale your team. It's not always just about code. I think we need, as developers, to look very much closely to ultimately who we're working with and what we're trying to do to try and evolve. So all sounds fancy, you might find that you want to get back to your teams on Monday, you want to start trying to figure out your file churn, maybe you want to start reimagining how you talk to each other and rubber ducking and 30-minute rules and that kind of thing. There's certainly lots of stuff that you can do now without trying to figure out all that stuff, because it's complicated. You can't just wake up tomorrow and start implementing that. There's absolutely stuff that you can do now. This applies somewhat to Rails, but from my point of view, I've worked with a lot of frameworks, the same rules apply. So there's tools like Rubocop, SonarCube will help you analyze your code and try and find where you have code smells, try and identify that kind of legacy code within your apps. As we've been moving over time, we've started removing the likes of gems like Devise. Devise is a gem that manages user authentication and sign-up, okay? And ultimately, it got to the point where we just couldn't extend it anymore. Our application was getting too tricky to manipulate. So when you find yourself in that scenario, you just got to get rid of your code dependency. Just cut it out and just write it yourself. Ultimately, it's just code. And I often find that people are afraid of that. They think that these, I don't know where people get the time to do it, but they have these, Devise as an open source gem. You can go up there and grab it. You can fork it yourself. Ultimately, a human wrote it. It's just code. So just, understand the code, rewrite it yourself, and try and understand how you can implement that in your product. Another one in there was Paperclip. Paperclip was a neat example because Paperclip was becoming highly used. It relies on a tool called ImageMagick, which you might be familiar with for manipulating images. ImageMagick was getting high on the radar as regards vulnerabilities and hackers. So Paperclip was a big target. So recognizing that kind of stuff can be extremely powerful for you. So just getting rid of gems like Paperclip. Again, it's just code. We just figured out how the thing works, and we rewrote it ourselves. Delayed job is an interesting one. It's super for bootstrapping your app, particularly if you're using Rails. Delayed job is like a queuing system, and it uses the database for doing that. Something I always remember as a developer, it's something my manager told me when I was 2 years out of college. He said that the fastest app in the world that uses a database is an app that doesn't use the database, okay? It's so important. So trying to make sure that your app is not making queries to the database. You can do a lot of work around performing, making sure that your SQL queries are performant, but making sure that you're not talking to the database that much is a good thing. But if you can avoid talking to it, it's an even better thing. So delayed job is an example of that. It's not scaling purely because of how it uses the database. So my advice in that case would be using the likes of Sidekick. Sidekick is amazing in the sense it uses Redis, but you can swap that out. You can use MongoDB or whatever you want as regards a queuing system. Kafka is the Ferrari of solutions, and Kafka I'd highly recommend if you're going to be looking into the likes of microservices. It's something that we're looking at LearnUpon. It's great because you're not reliant on using Rails code in our case. So like delayed job and Sidekick, they boot up a worker, which is your whole Rails app running in memory, which is just crazy, okay? You have to do it because you've got to start up, but ultimately Kafka will allow you to boot any kind of language you want. So like if you feel that something in a queue should be handled by Python, you can do it. If it needs to be Rust or Go or whatever the language, Kafka would allow you to do that. I wouldn't underestimate the concept of just raw SQL. So again, like Active Record, it's great. You can quickly write database code and manage how you're querying data and creating data. But ultimately, there's a lot to be said for just writing that in raw SQL. It makes it easier to port it. It certainly makes it easier to upgrade. One of the bigger pains that we had when we moved to Rails 5.2, they decided for whatever reason it would be a great idea to change how a where clause returns data. So it inverted it from an array to a hash or vice versa. I can't quite remember. Which is really tricky because if your code overall in your feature base and your product base are relying on that object to be an array or a hash, you've got huge problems. So going back to that idea of within your code base, have your finders, make sure that they're trying to just use as raw as possible when they're talking to the database. So you're not relying on those being objects. Then you can extrapolate it out. So you can write your finder layer, then you can have a layer that manipulates that data into a hash or an array, the format that your product needs it in, and then sky's the limit. Then when those kind of changes come in, you don't have to worry about them later on. So if we did it all again, would it be better? No, absolutely resounding no. We've learned a lot, and we continue to learn as we're evolving LearnUpon. But we wouldn't have a company today, and that's just the hidden truth. So again, like if any of you out there are looking to do a startup, you've got ideas, you're in the middle of a startup, ship product, just go for it. Use your knowledge, use your best intentions. Don't get too hung up on when you Google and you read all this Y Combinator news and hacker news about how Google are introducing these new AI mechanisms and scaling and so forth. Don't get too distracted by that. It's great to have the knowledge, but don't feel that you're inadequate because your startup isn't using DynamoDB with all this kind of cool stuff and SQS systems from Amazon. You'll probably find it's not necessary. Ultimately, perfectionism holds you back, which is that idea, like if you've over-engineered stuff, it's just going to hold you back. It's that factoid, if you've got no regrets, then you definitely over-engineer. And your attention to detail is ultimately the thing that's going to carry you through. So the likes of clean code from our friend Uncle Bob, who is here, like his book on clean code is a masterpiece. It's great. But ultimately, it's that idea of predicting change is impossible. Absolutely impossible. So there'll always be another JS, another ++, another Rails version 7 and 8, and all the rest as you go through. It's only going to get worse. And our jobs as developers gets more trickier and more trickier and more trickier as we evolve and as we grow. So you just got to be brave. You just got to dive in. But ultimately, don't forget, it's the idea that the one thing that we all have in common in this room, so be it that we're coding in Rails, we're coding in Go, we have our DBAs that nobody would stand of. We've various different types of people here. Like ultimately, the one thing in common is just we're human. We will make mistakes. Ultimately, that's it. We need to find ways to communicate better, and that's the one key thing that will help you scale, no matter what you do. So too long didn't read. Hopefully the talk was useful for you, but talking to your management, you've got to make legacy code a continued discussion. Ultimately, that's it. That's the one job that we have as developers. The second thing is finding the language to discuss that with your product owners and your management. And the idea that not all code is bad. You need to measure your ability to add features non-invasively. So file churn, going back to that measure, I would start there. Like if you're not doing it already, on Monday, try and figure out how you can start figuring out what your file churn is, because it will tell you a lot of stories. GitHub has some great reports. You can use a tool like Git Prime, which have a free, I think it's a 15-day free trial. So you could use that for 15 days, try and figure out what's going on in your GitHub environment. You'll instantly get metrics on what your dev team are doing and where they're struggling and the types of, or let's say the parts of the app that they're really struggling with. So that's me. Hopefully if anybody has any questions, I can answer them now. But our team are here. We're blue. We're not Smurfs, but we do like the blue color. That's our brand. So we're over outside somewhere that you can come and ask us any questions. I'd be happy to chat to you. Thanks very much. Any questions? I've got no PlayStation to give away, I'm afraid. Yeah, I've got a question here, I think.
Since nobody else is asking, will this be hosted anywhere so I can show it to management?
Say again, sorry?
Will this be hosted anywhere so I can show it to the management?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I'll give him my card, and then you can email me, and I can send it to you.
Thank you.
There we go, thanks. Anybody else? Over here, yep.
Management also.
Here we go. Okay, super. Fala Puno. Ciao.